Welcome back to Chatham House, those of you who had dinner with us last night, and welcome to new guests who have arrived with us today. And people and I mustn't forget our online guests too. And that's a very important point that Emma's just raising there, because this morning's session is going to be on the record that we're going to be having information sharing, we're going to be having panel discussions. So we are not going to be following the famous Chatham House rule this morning. So again, this is a sort of a public discourse, and this gives the online audience an opportunity to participate and join in. And therefore, as well, you're quite at liberty to go into your favorite social media platform and tweet what you're hearing and take photos. And we're very, very keen to get the message out there about the event. So my name is Robert Yates. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre for Universal Health here at Chatham House. And we sort of specialise in three broad topic areas of health security, universal health coverage, and healthy populations, really related to the social determinants of health. And I think, the topic that we're going to be discussing today, access to health services, access to medicines, really covers all those topics when you think about it. So we're delighted to be having this session, which very much fits in with our view looking at the political economy of health and health reforms. And as I mentioned last night, issues around access to services, access to medicines is perhaps one of the most political aspects of health and healthcare. So I think today's session is all sort of fairly set out for you in the briefing, and really my pleasure now just to do one or two little housekeeping things. First of all, the fire exit there and another route out to the front. We're not expecting any fire alarms there. In fact, we had a big fire alarm when we were all in the square just a couple of days ago. So if you hear the alarms, chances are it's the real deal. So we'd ask people to leave very briskly. The toilets are just down here, and then we'll be having lunch upstairs a little later on. But all I need to do now really is to hand over to Martin, the Director of Access. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten. Access Accelerator, of course. So Martin, welcome back to Chatham House. And if I can hand over you to lead off the session this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob, for welcoming us here in this very famous Chatham House. So fire escape, I hope that the fire will not be in the room, because sometimes the debate on access has been much heated. And part of the purpose is to bring rationality back and to make sure that we have a common understanding on how to create progress. You certainly have in mind a sentence attributed to Margaret Chan, the former director of a World Health Organization: what gets measured gets done. And I think that today we could add something, which is no improvement without robust measurement. And indeed, we have to deliver, we have to measure, we have to learn, we have to do better to go at scale on a sustainable manner. And indeed, if we consider the Sustainable Development Goals, we are halfway and far off track. So this means that we have to do much better, and in particular for the 3.1 on reducing premature mortality for chronic conditions, on 3.8 on progress on universal health coverage. So much work to do on that. And we have a common responsibility. Not only that, we have to act now to improve access to NCD prevention, treatment, and care worldwide, and focusing on underserved populations, but also that we have to find much more effective ways to accelerate progress. And so Access Accelerated, this initiative launched in 2017, is about that. It's developing new ways to improve access at scale for sustainable change, and of course, understand what works and what doesn't work through a learning process. And when we launched Access Accelerated, we decided to work with Boston University, and here, so namely with Veronica and Peter, to help the members have a better measurement framework to learn from the process on their own programs. And I think that's also part of our core principle with Access Accelerated is about open, transparent communication and rigorous measurement. And this led to the creation of the Access Observatory. And you will hear more about that, and you could read about that in the paper you received in advance to the meeting. And the observatory is a great progress and definitely could help members to improve their programmatic activities. So why is this dialogue today? So why discussing new science of access together? We think that social innovation is still much needed in the field of measurement and evaluation. First point, is there a need for harmonization and simplification? We have multiple players which are active in the field of measurement and evaluation. They assess what is developed by different type of contributors. They target different audiences, and many players are in that room, actually, the Access to Medicine Index, development agencies, academics, private sector representative, public, private entities together. So different stakeholders certainly have different views on that, but is there a common goal? Improving access at community level, is that? So can we reconcile the vision of what has to be measured that? And can we think about a model of framework which would allow different stakeholders to work with harmonized metrics? This would allow compatibility between different approaches. And just think about what is happening with Access Accelerated. 95% of our programs are delivered through partnerships and or multi-partnerships. So it's just not one actor delivering on a program, it's actors together. Do they speak the same language? And so we partner with NGOs, IGOs, government, development agencies, and most of the program focused on creating enabling environments for better access. So does it make any sense to have different evaluation frameworks to measure what is delivered here? And do we need specific metrics on communities, maybe just for the industry, but on the side of that, for enabling environments, I think we work against the same goals. And harmonization is certainly indispensable to have a common understanding of what are the most powerful interventions. And this is really important when it comes to informing policy choices. Don't miss this opportunity. Harmonization and simplification, even just for reporting, measurement comes with a cost. So it is resource, time demanding, and sometimes at company level, we end up duplicating our effort to fulfill different requirements. And again, how to create a common language to assess what is delivered. So, and last point on that, what is a good trade-off between simplification and granularity? Second point, how to incentivize collective action. So single company measurement ranking truly helped creating a positive competition between different biopharmaceutical companies to improve access. We could observe that over the last 12 years, but it comes with a real downside. Creating a competition between players, you create also incentives for solo and siloed approaches. And actually what we observe, and not only with Access Accelerated, is that we create the conditions for real sustainable change through collective and coordinated action and focusing on the communities. So this cross collaboration is a key condition of success. So what about the incentives for solo action on that? And what we also heard from governments, and very loud and clear, is that for the governments, having different players working on the same issues create transactions cost. So our responsibility is also to reduce that burden at country level to allow the government to develop at scale what is needed for the population. And so we started working 2 years ago with RTI International on a measurement framework to better capture what is delivered through the partnerships and multi-partnership approaches, including also from a qualitative perspective. And so RTI introduced a concept of connective tissue. And this represents a less tangible impact of collective effort, what binds stakeholders together, what builds coherence between different objectives and ways of working, and what leads to sustainable action over time. This is of utmost importance. And a key conclusion is that by working with local stakeholders, collaborating with multilateral, multi-sectoral stakeholders, by working to improve UHC, we can deliver at scale. So it's not about small pilots, it's about delivering at scale for the population. So how can we, through M&E, better incentivize collective action and better capture what makes this multi-partnership work efficiently? Key question. Maybe something not to be discussed today, but also a key technical question when it comes to chronic conditions specifically. It's about the time horizon. A key challenge with NCDs is that when you measure outputs, you don't know exactly what the health outcomes will be over time, because health outcomes are not immediate. And this is much less the case for infectious diseases. And our tradition in M&E comes from infectious diseases, actually. And so what are the incentives for working to address the NCD in a different manner? And this required a long-term perspective. And so for sustainable change and impact in the field of NCDs, different dimensions are to be considered, and definitely policy change, behavior change. So how can we make sure that through M&E we can capture what will deliver the impact over time? I would like to sincerely and warmly thank Veronica and Peter and the co-authors for the paper which you received in advance to the meeting. I think this is really strong food for thought. Thank you to Chatham House for organizing that meeting and convening the important dialogue. And so Rob and team, we definitely need your secured and trusted environment for this frank discussion. So discussion, do we have a common understanding of the benefits and the limits of available M&E tools? Do we agree on the need for harmonization and simplification, on the need for incentives? And we still need to innovate on the measurement space. We need to work together and better coordinate to define effective solutions for these technical challenges. Today, it's maybe less to discuss the technical challenges themselves, but to understand what is a roadmap to work together to define what has to be done in the near future. Thank you. Peter, over to you.
Maybe just for the folks at home, a quick introduction. I'm Peter Rockers. I'm an associate professor at Boston University. So I'm gonna reiterate some of what Martin has said. So first, maybe a question: how should partnerships involving industry be measured? So the framing of this question implies a set of technical issues to be addressed. To answer, we could propose a set of methods, instruments, indicators. And as Martin mentioned, this is something that our team at Boston University has worked on for more than 5 years, establishing the Access Observatory within Access Accelerated. We made important progress in addressing some of the key technical issues about how to measure partnerships like this. Key technical challenges remain. However, our interest today is not in a technical interpretation of the question. So let's reframe the question a little bit. So what information and data should partnerships involving the industry collect and report on? This gets us a little bit closer to today's topic, though again, we're not interested in answering this question in the room today. Instead, our goal is to recognize that to answer this question requires a deliberative process involving a diverse set of stakeholders. And what we want to do today is to start to generate ideas for what such a process might look like. But we should view this question through a political economy lens. And Chatham House is an ideal place to do so, as Rob mentioned at the beginning. And by nature of industry's involvement in these partnerships, they have an incredible diversity of stakeholders, each with a unique perspective on what data and information should be collected and reported. Indeed, many of these stakeholders have their own perspective on what the goals of these partnerships should be, how they should operate, and what defines success. And we learned this while we worked on the Access Observatory. We discussed approaches to measurement. We discussed technical issues with a broad set of stakeholders. And I think we were always struck by the diversity of perspectives and understanding that the political economy lens is really a key to making progress in this space. It's not simply a technical challenge. So a deliberative process involving open dialogue among key stakeholders is needed to identify and reinforce the principles where there are agreement, to negotiate and make compromises around differences when possible. And yes, there will be differences that are not amenable to compromise or agreement, and those need to be recognized, and we need to minimize friction around those differences. It's not realistic to think that we'll get perfect agreement across such a diversity of stakeholders. But what's really important is to have a process to negotiate and discuss some of these differences and find agreement where we can. And I want to just reiterate what Martin said: what gets measured gets done. So the stakes here are quite high. This isn't simply a discussion around what to measure. It's not a technocratic discussion. What gets measured creates very strong incentives around how these partnerships operate, and has really important implications for patients around the world. So in preparation for this meeting, Veronica Wirtz and co-authors Carlotta Cellini, Jens Gruger, and Prashant Yadav, as well as myself, we produced a paper that looked at many of these issues. So in the paper, we reviewed several measurement frameworks developed across a set of key stakeholders that represent very different perspectives. We examined each framework's purpose, the core principles, and key technical details related to the methods of measurement. The Access Observatory was one of the frameworks that we reviewed. Based on this review, we proposed a set of considerations for how the work to harmonize frameworks to develop that deliberative process should go forward. And that's what we're hoping to talk about in more detail this afternoon, but also this morning. So in general terms, just to give you a little bit more concrete information, key stakeholders include governments, multilateral organizations like WHO, civil society groups. Many of these groups who tend to base their asks for data from these partnerships on the principle of accountability, right? They're looking for documentation of progress towards fulfillment of commitments made. The industry has made important commitments, and we need to understand progress towards fulfilling those commitments. That's one aspect of why it's of what we're looking for in how these partnerships are measured. Also important are the companies themselves. Companies are making significant investments in these partnerships, and they need to feel confident that those investments are justified. The companies themselves, these are complex institutions, and internally, the folks who work on these partnerships answer to internal stakeholders and require good information and good data in order to make the case within the company to continue investments in partnerships. Finally, another key group is investors. Right? Investors need to be part of this discussion. There's an increasing dynamic of ESG funds. We're not going to spend a ton of time today digging into technical questions around ESG, but we need to recognize that ESG funds are a growing force in this work, and these funds have their own asks from companies for data and information around participation in these types of partnerships. And we need to keep that in mind. In terms of the ESG funds, they're often asking for information about social impact. Excuse me. It's still, at this point, how they define social impact is still a work in progress. So the review we present in the paper that we circulated to those who are here in person before this meeting looks at approaches to measurement by stakeholders across these different groups. And there's some good news. First, there's a wealth of technical expertise across all of these different stakeholder groups. Each of them has developed their own framework that is a strong framework. And they have a lot of experience in administering those frameworks. So I think in terms of technical expertise across these stakeholder groups, this is not going to be a barrier to solving these challenges. Okay. Second, there is broad agreement across many of the frameworks. Many of the approaches are actually quite consistent, which puts this work on very solid footing for moving forward. So the observed agreement establishes a solid foundation, but a key next step is to harmonize the frameworks and iron out differences. So to be clear, I do not mean to suggest that the end goal should be a single framework that meets the needs of all stakeholders. This is not realistic. The goal should be to reinforce where there's agreement, compromise around differences where possible, and minimize friction where differences are not amenable to compromise. The technical issues will not be the main barrier. We need to view this through a political economy lens, bring stakeholders together to facilitate better discussion around how to move this work forward. Excuse me. So I'd like to reframe that initial question around how to measure partnerships in a second way. How can we strengthen our knowledge of what works in the context of these partnerships and use rigorous evidence to develop new, more effective partnerships in the future? So in preparation for this meeting, I, along with co-authors Veronica Wirtz and Brendan Shaw, produced a second paper arguing that new efforts are needed to advance the science of access. The two papers we're discussing approach the issue of measurement through different lenses. The first paper is largely concerned with measurement as a means of observing existing efforts to increase access, to document activities, in some instances evaluate impacts. The products of this type of observation generate immediate value for a broad group of stakeholders. The second paper is concerned with measurement as a core tool of science, to improve our understanding of how things work and to catalyze innovation to address pressing social challenges. The products of the scientific process, while often realized over a longer time horizon, have great potential to drive future success in achieving UHC. And these two approaches to measurement have important complementarities. So we feel that companies should adopt the science of access lens when designing and measuring their access programs to ensure rigor, maximize effectiveness. However, advancing the science of access in a meaningful way will require looking beyond existing company efforts and even outside the industry itself to find new, potentially disruptive innovations that could be integrated into the design of future industry strategies. So briefly, what do we mean by the science of access? The science of access coheres around a set of questions. It's not a new discipline. It's comprised of several disciplines. So some of these disciplines focus on human behavior and social systems, psychology, economics, understanding behavioral aspects of access barriers. Part of the science of access is focused on firms and organizations that deliver goods and services, management, finance, right? The former are important for designing effective strategies, and the latter are important for delivering strategies at a large scale in a financially sustainable manner. So the science of access can make use of and adapt existing conceptual and empirical tools developed across a range of disciplines. So the Access Observatory is an initial conceptual framework, common set of concepts and terms for describing access strategies. And this framework can continue to evolve as the harmonization work that we previously discussed progresses. We'll continue to better understand conceptually how we think about access strategies. Case studies, descriptive analyses have an important role to play as empirical tools, refining the design of new strategies. Once an innovation has reached a certain level of maturity, impact evaluation can be used to quantify its causal effects, and in some instances, to examine causal mechanisms and their relative importance in driving overall impact. Costing studies are important for understanding long-term financial sustainability, cost-benefit analysis, for examining whether new innovation should be prioritized over alternative strategies. So applying some of these empirical tools can help us really sharpen our understanding of the science of access, how these partnerships are working, so that we can develop an evidence base and build on that. And the pharmaceutical industry is very well suited to play a leadership role in this effort to advance the science of access. So science is at the center of what the industry does. Companies have significant expertise in managing processes of scientific discovery. The industry has business expertise important to scaling up and sustainably financing innovations. Advancing the science of access is in the industry's interest. Companies benefit from expanded access commercially through expansion of their products market. They have incentives to drive and co-finance access innovation and to accelerate broad adoption of proven strategies. Okay, the last point. New investments in the science of access should be deployed within a coherent research and development strategy that aims to optimize returns across a portfolio of investments. Social science R&D that leads to social innovation has the same key features as basic science R&D that leads to product innovation. A portfolio approach with a diverse set of investments is important for managing risk and allows for coordinated investments in complementary areas of science, which have the potential to generate synergistic returns. So one thing we propose in the paper that we shared is the establishment of a new access innovation fund and corresponding government unit tasked with building a strategic portfolio of R&D investments designed to advance the science of access and accelerate progress towards achieving UHC. The fund should advance the science of access as open science, where the products of that science are published in the public domain and therefore is a public good. This would justify contributions from organizations representing the public interest, as well as investments from industry. A recent analysis of a similar social science R&D fund suggests that the social return on investment can be extraordinarily high. For those here in the room, we look forward to discussing these issues with you in more detail this afternoon and hopefully charting a path forward. Our goal in the afternoon is to first have an open discussion around these topics and towards the end of the meeting start to coalesce around some more concrete ideas for next steps. For those joining virtually, we invite you to also engage with the discussion. You can put comments in the chat right now. You can also email me directly. My email should be in the chat as well. Thank you all. Looking forward to the rest of the day.
Okay, thank you very much for joining everyone online. And for those in the room, we're now going to move on to the interactive panel discussion. So I have with me today Margot Warren to my immediate left, who's the Director of Policy Access to Medicine Foundation, and Michael Thirst, Global Head of Social Business at UCB. And on the screen with us also is Hannah Kettler, who is the Director of Design and Operationalization at COVAX and Gavi, the Vaccine Initiative, Vaccine Alliance. So thank you very much. So I just want to take this conversation forward a bit and actually maybe take a step back, actually to start with, and picking up on some of what both Martin and Peter have said, really to discuss this idea of harmonization first. So my first question really, and let's start with you, Margot, and also I'd like to hear from all of you on this, of what really this is really to take a step back on what is the need for harmonization? Do we really need it? Because to me, that sounds like quite a painful process. We talked about negotiating. We heard about the need to negotiate and frictions and all that. Seems like quite not an easy process. So do we really need harmonization? And why do we need it? What is the shortcomings of the way things are measured now? And what's the promise of, if we have harmonization, what can we look forward to on this? So Margot, do you want to address that first?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. I think this is a really timely conversation. And I think we say harmonization a lot, and it's hard to unpack that sometimes. What does that really mean? I think there's a lot of different organizations out there that are trying to measure impact, that are thinking about how do you make those results sort of more transparent? How do you put them in the public domain? What does that look like? But ultimately, being able to sort of harmonize all of those different initiatives, like the Access to Medicine Index, like Access Accelerated and the Access Observatory, and being able to really say, you're measuring this, and you're measuring this, and you're measuring this, ultimately reduces duplication. It reduces the burden, particularly on companies when it comes to reporting. You want to be reporting on sort of one thing that's really valuable and really important to one entity, not sort of to 3 or 4 on the exact same thing. And being able to do that enables organizations to collect really rich, important data and to be able to share that in the public domain. And I think when there is duplication, you sort of risk that particularly companies are not sort of able to provide that same level of detail because it can be burdensome across multiple different parties. But if they're only reporting one specific thing to one specific party, the data can be that much richer and can be that much more detailed. And I think that's a really critical part of harmonization and why it's so valuable, because ultimately we want to be able to measure progress. We want to be able to demonstrate that these projects are really valuable and they're really reaching the people who need them the most. But we need to have that rich data and we need to have that involvement and that engagement. And you really risk that when things are not harmonized.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to move to Michael, and to pick up on something that Margot said spurred me. So from a business perspective, what do you think the areas she talked about not putting too much burden on companies, that everybody's asking them to measure this and put the data on that? What do you think are the concerns about all the measurement that's going on out there? What would you like to see from the perspective of getting businesses, companies on board with participating? And where do you see the challenges in participation? And how does the industry look at this? Is it considered a huge burden that they've got to do to look good, or do they think it's completely chaotic? Are they quite happy? Where is industry in this? Individual companies, and what is it going to take to get them to be harmonized? And do you even accept the need for harmonization?
So thanks a lot, Emma, for the question. Obviously, I can't speak for the industry or for private sector in general terms, but I surely have exchanged with many peers around that topic. And when you look into the requests that are arriving on the desks of company representatives with regards to data provision from many different parts of the spectrum, it can be ATMI, it can be a rating agency, it can be an investor, it's really, really difficult because there is, I would say, complete diversity and sometimes ambiguity what the question is really about. And to find the data to respond then to those very different informational needs is really creating complexity and a lot of reporting burden on companies. Now, therefore, just from an efficiency point of view, I believe it would be beneficial if there would be more harmonized approaches. But I would completely agree with Peter that harmonization effort will not be a sprint. It will be a relatively long journey, I would say. And what I would expect from private sector is to engage in that discussion and not stay away, wait until somebody has worked on that and then complain about the result. That's maybe not a good idea. So what I expect from private sector is engage and play a productive role in that conversation and be on that journey together with others. And there's a clear reason from a public or global health perspective why companies should do that. We are talking about policy changes, as an example, based on certain access interventions that hopefully work or don't show to work. And those policy changes should come based on evidence. So it's in our own interest that we provide good quality data, robust data, so that informed policy choices can be made. And in order to land in that point, we need to provide data, meaningful information, and not just noise. I don't think that this would be a good option. Now, one last thing on the economic dimension. If we agree, let's just make an assumption. If we would agree that access is a material topic, material in the sense of ESG, it is pretty clear that asset allocation from the investor side needs to be based on good quality information in regard to that material issue, because transparency and good quality information is like a basic ingredient of an efficient economy. And proper investment hypothesis and proper asset allocation. And if we would say that an investor wants to support companies that do rigorous investments into access approaches, and that's a preferable, let's say, investment choice, because this company is better in terms of managing risks related to that material topic access, or is able to unlock value from an investment in that material issue access, then I believe it's in our own self-interest to provide that data. However, it's not good if every company provides different information, because then how should an investor look into the investment hypothesis and find out what the preferable investment and asset allocation strategy for the portfolio that they are creating is actually about? So this is much more than just a public health debate. I believe it is a very, very important discussion when you think about it in the economic context, when you think about the importance of ESG, when you think about materiality. I think we need to really beef up that reporting and measurement paradigm and become much more serious about it. It's in our interest, but it's also, I think, a key ingredient to a well-working economy.
Thank you. Do you think there is agreement on what should be measured, and what are those what are the metrics that need to be engaged with?
I don't think that there is any agreement. And of course, there's standardization happening at the moment. You know, ISSB, SASB, the reporting frameworks at the European level, SEC is doing some work. So there's a lot of stuff happening at the moment, but there is no real congruence. Maybe I can say it this way. And I think it's problematic. When you look into SASB as an example, the pharmaceutical, the industry supplement, there are questions that are maybe not satisfying the informational need in order to make those informed choices. One reference point in that SASB standard is Access to Medicines Index. And I appreciate the work from ATMI, for sure. I think great work done. But do we really believe that this is giving sufficient information to a portfolio manager or an investor, whether an investment into a company is looking in these risk areas or in these value areas in the way I described it earlier? Do we really believe that this information is sufficient? It's sufficient enough to make good investment choices? I don't think so. So we need to work on that convergence.
So will it be up to the community, whatever that is, or someone to take responsibility for understanding and articulating what's missing and what needs to be done? Does that conversation need to happen, and who should lead that?
You know, I think the conversation is happening. I'm just wondering whether there's enough engagement from the private sector side to really come up with something that is valuable in terms of measurement and reporting. I don't want to criticize SASB. They have made an effort. I appreciate that. But is there enough engagement in terms of further developing the metrics? I would not say so. I think there needs to be more engagement, and we need these fora to agree on those metrics and find common ground.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. I'd like to come to you now on this, on the metrics. What do you see as the most likely areas that will need negotiating and compromise, and where do you think the tensions are going to be, the frictions? Well, first of all, do you agree with what Peter said, that there are going to be areas and this whole need to bring alignment, and what do you see as the challenges in that area?
Sure. Thanks for having me online. And I'll be honest, this is me walking back into a world I haven't been in for a number of years, having been at COVAX now for 3.5 years, so fully living in the details of the day in, day out of the pandemic. And maybe I'll just link this conversation quickly to that experience, just as an illustration of, I think, the importance of having sort of, as much as responding to a pandemic, people didn't have a lot of time to sit back and make sure that things we were designing were exactly in line with a kind of clear set of metrics. But as we're coming out, and we're having a lot of evaluations of the different approaches and responses, and a very kind of fervored effort to start to put together what would an operational plan preparedness look like in the future. I would, concur with Michael. There's this risk of, in the absence of having sort of specific measurable sense of what works and what doesn't, you do risk having sort of initiatives that sort of purport to have access as a driver, but there isn't real alignment around sort of what that goal, how to measure that and what that would look like. And so, and also agree, people are coming to the table with pretty strong politically driven views from all sides about what works and what doesn't. And yet we've just come out of this very, very detailed experience where we have a lot of information and a lot of data. So I think there's a real opportunity, as much as it's not necessarily representative of global health partnerships overall. It was an amazing, but also very challenging example of building off of platforms that we had, whether that was Gavi, CEPI, other types of partnerships that were grounded in decades of public-private partnerships, many of which have access at its core. And so being able to build off those institutions and those approaches, and then as we come to the end of the pandemic, trying to think through, well, what have we learned and what do we want to, retain and move ahead. As far as sort of the value, again, of harmonizing methods, again, I think we're trying to sort through what are frameworks for responding to outbreaks of different types right now. And I think thinking through sort of what the roles and responsibilities of different partners are in that space, including private sector, is again a critical piece to that. And I think thinking through what has worked in others and being able to look to models and well-articulated models would be real benefit. So I guess I'm speaking more from the standpoint of a consumer of well-articulated models and of lessons, and what are the parallels that we could draw from that. And again, with an eye not only to an economic benefit, so per investors, but also I think real benefit to, as we try to ensure better preparedness for the next time, that we ground those models and those kind of programs now in well-articulated lessons. So there's a real benefit, I think, from this conversation for that set of issues as well.
Thanks. So can I just press you on I heard a lot about what we need to look at as far as what works and what doesn't, but from the experience of the pandemic, what have we learned about what works? So yes, we have to learn the lessons and look at what has worked, but what's emerging for you now? I know I'm not expecting you to have done your post-pandemic analysis and give us, but what are you ready? We know what we need to look at and the kind of things we need to look for, but is there anything emerged that we can see already of what have we learned about how to do more effective partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example potentially will be around the question, of sort of access to vaccines specifically and the product specific questions. Within COVAX, and again, it wasn't the exclusive focus, but one of the priorities was how do you ensure early access such that, core populations weren't left behind. And in fact, definitely all throughout the pandemic, the objective was actually to ensure everyone was getting vaccinated, ideally at an equitable rate. And so what considerations need to be put into R&D considerations such that, so global access agreements have a long life in global health. They were an instrumental part of some of the COVID response. But of all the products that went forward and successfully were approved, only a few of them actually had global access agreements associated with them, such that, COVAX as an initiative in this example, but where there was explicit intention to secure doses for a low and middle income country populations at volume, at scale, in a timely way. And that was, a lesson learned was, while there was success in raising funding and being able to negotiate for doses, so much importance came with early doses and the timeliness of it. And that came with pre-planning in a few specific instances of early, so an end-to-end approach across with a core kind of assumption that you're engaging with private sector, not just from the point at which a product is approved, but also already during the R&D process as one example.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And I see Margot nodding because this all sounds very indexy. Yeah, so can you pick up from, sorry, from where Hannah was talking, but also address, should we be talking about measuring the effectiveness of these partnerships or the effectiveness of industry's participation in partnership? Do you think there's a difference there? And which one should we be looking at? And also, what's your experience? I saw triggers there on earlier access planning and the role, if you could also address how that ties in with enabling environments.
Yes, I'll do my best for several questions, but certainly, yeah, I would agree with Hannah for sure. I think one of the lessons from COVID is that we certainly saw that R&D alone is not enough, and that access really needs to be embedded very early on in that R&D process. For example, when we think about the value of partnerships in general, the Access to Medicine Index found in the most recent index published back in November that roughly 30% of the priority R&D projects were being done actually in collaboration with access-oriented organizations. So organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, like Wellcome Trust, or with PDPs such as the NDI, for example. And this is across the board, not just for infectious diseases. But 30% of priority R&D being done sort of in these very clear partnerships is really interesting. Additionally, over half of the priority R&D projects were actually being done in collaboration with those receiving sort of public contributions. So we know that partnerships are really successful in advancing new projects and R&D, but we know that equally they're very important in advancing access. Because what we also found was that when we were looking at all of those projects in the pipeline and whether or not they had comprehensive access plans attached to them, we found that those that were done in collaboration had significantly stronger access plans. So thinking about prioritizing access from phase 2 and onward while a project is still in the pipeline. And those plans were so much more comprehensive and involved a lot of different sort of access components in comparison to those that were not done in collaboration. So we know the value of partnerships is huge, but we also know that it's really critical to then evaluate sort of what does that access look like? What is the role of a company in sort of committing to make sure that their products are available and affordable? It's not enough to just develop a wonderful new efficacious product if you're not making it available and affordable to those who need it the most. So that's really at the crux of what we do at the foundation, and being able to assess sort of how are those partnerships going? Is there a benefit to expanding this? Is there a benefit to making sure that a really successful project that's done in collaboration is available in more countries to more people, is reaching more populations? That's ultimately sort of what really needs to be measured. So I think to answer both your questions, I think both are important, but ultimately being able to really see what that value add of the partnership from the pharmaceutical company is critical for sure.
Okay. Do you have a sense of when negotiating or trying to harmonize so that we're measuring, so we can be more comparable, right? When we're measuring that, what are most likely to be the areas that are going to have the tension in it? You've got a lot of experience in trying to collect data, trying to squeeze info out of companies. Where are the sensitivities and in relation to this, in bringing them together for more coherence and less duplication, less burden, more effectiveness? What are going to be the flashpoints and the hotspots?
Yeah, it's certainly something that I think evolves over time. So when you think about, we were talking a little bit earlier, when you think about sort of the first Access to Medicine Index in 2008, we were looking at very different things. The industry was at a very different place, and there's been so much progression and so much evolution in terms of what those main priorities are and what the expectations are from the global health community. And the benefit of the Access to Medicine Index is that we're able to evolve over time. We're able to revise the methodology. We're able to look at different elements and to really continue to raise the bar and create sort of that incentive structure that changes with the time and that is responsive. For example, it's a totally different ecosystem as we reflect on COVID-19 and some of the challenges that we saw in the global health community and the expectations for pharmaceutical companies. And we have to respond to that. We have to be able to change those metrics. One area that we've been looking at over the past several years, and we will continue to look at, is measuring patient reach and what that looks like for any program, particularly those that are being developed in partnership. It's absolutely critical.
By patient reach, sorry, actually getting products
Yes.
into the bodies of patients.
Yes, exactly. And if you have a collaborative project that's ultimately aiming to reach a certain population with a certain product, how do you ensure that you're actually measuring that? How do you ensure that you're able to demonstrate that you have improved patient reach? And if you have been able to demonstrate that and you do have the evaluation, what are the next steps? And how is the company going to think about, this has been a really successful project, let's expand it to more places and ultimately keep raising that sort of patient reach bar and keep thinking about it more critically.
But is patient reach going to be one of the areas of tension or compromise or negotiation? Why are you mentioning patient reach?
I think so. And I think so for a variety of reasons. I think at the moment, right now, we're seeing different companies measure patient reach in very different ways. We're seeing them really contemplate, what does this look like? What does this mean? It's a relatively newer area in terms of the transparency around it. So I think companies have been doing this for a long time, but they haven't been sharing those learnings as openly and as transparently as I think they can be in the future. And I think this is one of the areas where we do need to sort of collectively come together and think about, what does this look like, best case scenario? What does this mean in terms of the different metrics that are out there? And how can we sort of continuously encourage companies to share this information and to be more open about it? And I think being able to sort of all be on the same page about what those expectations truly are is certainly something that I think is valid.
I would imagine that so now we're back to products, but of course there are other aspects of these partnerships on the enabling environments and stuff. But even if I guess when you're talking about patient reach, how are you measure the activity, the access promoting activity in an enabling environment that, to what extent does it get closer to patient reach? And I guess patient reach, to everyone would understand, if the medicine gets to the patient, that's the ultimate. Well, obviously if their health improves, but that's very hard to prove or to pin on it, to do a cause and effect. But if we're talking about the endpoint being patient reach, I guess agreeing on what that means, but are you saying that there's likely to be tensions about that? Because that looks the best, but there's a lot of fudge in that area, and there may be reluctance to commit to being pinned down to a certain way of measuring it. Is that the tension, or where is the tension? Why would patient reach be something for negotiation or a bit of a wobbly, sensitive area to navigate?
I think it's a very complex. It's a very complex thing to measure. It's a very unique thing to measure for different products, for different populations. And being able to just sort of standardize that is not necessarily an area of tension, but it's an area of complexity. And I think whenever you have an area where it's very complex and it's sort of a newer thing for companies to think about, you can face some resistance, or you can just ultimately end up with a very different playing field where some companies are very advanced and others are not as advanced, and sort of getting everyone to the same level and getting everyone to think about it in the same way and to prioritize it in the same way can take some time. It can take some negotiation, but I think the appetite is there. I think we've seen that this is a priority for many companies, but it's figuring out what does sort of standardization look like, and how can we encourage companies that may not be as committed sort of meet their peers. And that's ultimately a really important part of the index. It's that peer-to-peer comparison. It's that best practice identification of, look, maybe as a company, you've struggled with how to do this. but now we can show you a best practice of what good looks like and sort of examples of how this could be done.
Michael, do you agree that patient reach is going to be one of the big goals, and that it's quite complex? So I see you nodding a lot. What do you think the issues are around this, or if you have other opinions of what are likely to be the areas where there's going to need to be compromise and maybe a bit of tension when we're talking about harmonizing or agreeing on a science or a way to do this to improve access? But first of all, could you address, is patient reach the thing right now? And what are your feelings about, what about it?
I'm not sure whether it's the thing, because it's dependent on the intervention that you are using, right? You can use different interventions to improve access, and dependent on that intervention, patient reach might be the thing. But if you're maybe looking more into system strengthening activities, maybe patient reach is not the thing. Maybe then it's more improvement of capacity and capabilities within the system that is the thing. But what I believe patient reach demonstrates very clearly is the need for harmonization and getting together and create a common understanding what kind of a methodology should be used to make ourselves measurable and comparable. Patient reach is used for a long time in the industry, I fully agree. But when you look at the methodologies that are used across the sector, it is, to put it mildly, diverse. And of course, this is not measured on real patient reach in most cases. It's based on volumes calculations. So it's not about, did the product really reach the patient? And as an output indicator, I can live with that if the methodology is robust, right? It's maybe illusionary to believe that we trace every pill or every product until it reaches the patient. So I can live, let's say, with models in that measurement space, but the models and the methodology should be fairly robust in order to have good evidence whether the intervention works towards that goal or not, and make then the intervention comparable, create evidence that this would be a preferable, let's say, activity or intervention from a private sector player that then can maybe also help to improve policy choices or inform policy choices. So it is an important indicator without any doubt, but whether it's the thing, I'm not sure, for the reason that I mentioned.
Okay, Hannah, what do you think about patient reach? Should this be a focus? Is it a, and especially in your area, that it's quite easy to measure that?
You would think so. I mean, I was going to say, a key metric or metrics in the pandemic for sure were vaccines delivered and then coverage, and even trying to get to the level of where target populations reached, which again led us into areas that I think overlap quite a bit with some of the non-communicable disease challenges of reaching patients, because there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of the adult populations or patients with comorbidities that may not be the primary target for some of the traditional infectious disease programs. So I think it is a challenge. What I was thinking as both Michael and Margaret were speaking is in the effort to, one is what's industry's level of commitment to contributing or kind of to measuring, being held accountable, I guess, to reaching patients. But then there's the associated, when you look at what works and what doesn't, a lot of it comes down to who are your partners and sort of what's the infrastructure that exists in terms of whether it's the governments themselves. And again, lots of evidence to come around which countries in the pandemic were able to do more or less of a job of supporting the actual vaccination of populations, because it wasn't, in that case, manufacturers that were in the country distributing vaccines. But when you think about drugs and diagnostics, you need the manufacturer committed and engaging with partners, but they also need to be matched with players that can make either the system investments associated and so on. And what I think is interesting is like who's driving the need and the demand for those comparable types of investments, and how much of that, and then it comes back to access to medicine holding, who's accountable for ensuring that that type of investment is made. It also links, I see Prashant online, but there's a lot of investment in what would be the innovations that might stem out of a desire to better track. So whether that's, sort of barcodes and other things that have come up in the vaccine space that are somewhat associated with wastage and sort of tracking, do vaccines get used, or are they out of date and could they get thrown out? But some of that could also feed into, how are you going to actually know whether things get to patients? The only other thing I'll add, since I'm speaking just on a separate topic, I think technology transfer and the kind of the hypothesis around source of supply and whether it's enough to make something available from New Jersey, or if it's required that it be transferred and creating capacity in country, and sort of I think that's also a very, it became acute in the pandemic because the concentration of manufacturing, even at scale, even at affordability, with the various nature of the bans and purchasing, meant that most countries were left waiting because they didn't have their own capacity, which is triggered, as many people know, almost the reverse response, which is like, we need manufacturing everywhere. But I think that's, to me, another, and I know it's been a access to medicines index metric that they've been looking at, but I think that question mark of what does being a good access partner from the standpoint of contributing to capacity building and sustainability is also another topic that I think is really interesting. And I'm not sure what harmonizing around that necessarily means, but it's an acute kind of policy debate right now that I think is a good one to tackle as well. Thanks.
Yeah, so just to carry on that, when you mentioned what part is the industry's responsibility, when we're talking about trying to measure the effectiveness of these partnerships in which the industry is involved, do you think there is a need to examine both the effectiveness of the partnership or the effectiveness or the effectiveness of the industry's participation? Those are slightly different, but also that goes to whose responsibility is what within that partnership.
Yeah.
You're judging the effectiveness, just what the industry does, but there are other issues with the way the partnership's structured or other partners. Do you think there is value in measuring both, or is that just too much? We're going to get measuring.
Well, again, I mean, I guess for me, I mean, it's very complicated. Again, if you then aspire on top of that to have a harmonized approach to that, but I do think the matter, and it comes then back to how much do people, are they concerned about ratings or concerned about the economics, or what is the incentives framework that drives manufacturers to engage in this space? But the degree to which you're able, then there's also, back to Michael's point, there's then an incentive to know, well, what models work and who are partners that you can rely on, because if you're actually being held accountable, you can't build all of that, and nor should a manufacturer be expected to. But in terms of being curious and seeking out means through which to succeed, I actually think, again, others, Margot's closer to kind of how practical it is to really measure that intention, recognizing it doesn't always pay off. But I do think that sort of looking for means through which they can, a manufacturer in this case, or a partnership in general, can succeed depends a lot on what's documented about who's accomplished what and through what route. So,
Margot, what do you think? Anything to come back on?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I think what we saw, particularly in COVID, we hosted a roundtable in June of 2021 with quite a few different pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things that came up quite clearly was that companies were relying on existing partnerships throughout the pandemic to deliver medicines. And that sort of instinct to rely on a trusted partner was a really critical element ultimately in the end of how products were delivered globally. So it speaks to the importance of those pre-existing relationships and those partnerships, not just being useful for that time and the place, but also in the future, because in a time of need, you can rely on them and you can do things in a much more expedited fashion when they are proven to work, and when there is that data to say, yes, this was successful, let's utilize a similar model, or let's utilize sort of a similar approach. And that can be, I think, hugely beneficial, and is a really important part of this whole conversation around monitoring, and this whole conversation around publicly reporting on outcomes, and being honest and upfront and vulnerable as a company to say, we tried this and it didn't work. And this partnership didn't work because of X, Y, Z, and next time around we'll make changes and we'll learn and we'll grow and we'll take a different approach. Or if it was really successful, we'll try it again and we'll try to expand it. And I think that's the hugely beneficial element of all this, is that you can learn and you can grow and you can do things differently. There were a lot of lessons learned in COVID-19, but I think ultimately you need to be able to accept that and move on and improve, and having all of these different evaluation mechanisms and streamlining them and having that public reporting approach and that transparency enables that learning for individual companies on their own initiatives, and for other companies to see as well sort of what works and what doesn't. And I think there was some interesting conversation previously and some interesting speaking points around, are companies sort of willing to engage and have these conversations, or is it seen as sort of, this is my trade secret in access and I don't want to share it? But what we've seen ultimately in the index is that companies are very open about what they're doing, and there's a lot of learning and there's a lot of really interesting sort of collaboration that can occur either behind the scenes or in sort of side conversations. And that's hugely valuable because companies can learn from one another, and it doesn't need to be seen sort of in the same competitive way as the R&D space per se, but access is something that everyone can learn from, and access is something that there are going to be things that work better than others, and learning from your peers is really valuable and can really ultimately lead to better progress and better outcomes and better impacts for all projects.
I see Michael writing there. What are you writing? What's up?
A number of things.
What do you think?
A few thoughts about partnerships. I think partnerships are great because they can give comfort that you try to innovate with a partner on new things and really come up with that trusted body, so to say, based on previous experience, that you want and can do new things together. But sometimes it's also a little bit too comfortable because you know each other and maybe you don't want to challenge the other because you know them well. And that's, of course, an enemy to good measurement and to a robust understanding whether that partnership really leads to the right results. Therefore, I believe it needs to be a key ingredient of every partnership, historic or new one, that you're open and honest towards each other and say, let's not just talk about the successes in that partnership, which is always nice, but let's be very clear about the failures in those partnerships. And that's not easy because sometimes you have maybe even a hierarchical kind of situation in such partnerships. There is somebody that pays and somebody that receives a fund to make things happen, an execution partner or something like this. And in such kind of situations, open and honest conversations on failures is not easy, but it's very much needed. And in that access world, because it's so complex, it is very much needed to talk about failures and not just successes. And by the way, this relates to every constituency in that access space: governments, private sector, NGOs, development agencies, etc. So putting things on the table in partnerships, not just in terms of great, well done, but also in terms of not so well done, not achieved, is, I believe, a very, very important thing to do in order to create the right results. The other thing with regards to openness and transparency and creating a kind of a bandwagon effect in the industry is an important debate to have. Many, many years ago, when Boston University started to partner with Novartis Access, or Novartis on Novartis Access, one of the key things the company Novartis has decided back then, together with Boston University, is to create complete transparency on that measurement work. Even the master service agreements and the scope of work documents have been published. The data access was ensured for every party that has a justified interest, a legitimate interest, to get the raw data. There were a whole flurry of publications as transparent as possible. And I think that's still an example how a company can think about, how do we actually want to drive the debate, create a common understanding on what's needed, and be as transparent as possible, and in principle completely disclose whether the program leads to the right results or whether a program fails in certain aspects. And when I look into some of the results of Novartis Access, not everything was perfect. There were failures that had to be recognized. But I believe it has led to the situation that many could say, if we would do something similar, these are the things we have to change. Because again, there was no hidden agenda. It was really done in a very open and transparent fashion. So creating a public good, a common good, is one of the things that I believe is really important in that work. One last thing on the topic of patient reach. Hannah spoke about tech transfer.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
And it can be a very important instrument, not just with regards to vaccines in the COVID context, but in more general terms. Now, if a company does tech transfer, this company could not talk about patient reach as the thing, because they would not reach the patients anymore. It's the company that then locally manufactures the product. However, we would all say, wasn't it a great choice from that company to do that? Because it has enabled access. It has enabled economic stimulus maybe in that country where local manufacturing then actually happens. So what I just want to say, it is really dependent on the intervention that we are talking about in regard to which indicator we need to choose. And tech transfer can be a great thing, but it would then not lead, let's say, to better patient reach results for the company that is doing.
Yeah, sure. I guess there has to be a way to recognize the value of that tech transfer. I mean, if I'm not saying that patient reach is the ultimate thing.
No,
I wanted to ask you guys.
It's just a good example that demonstrates the complexity and also the need for a robust thinking about the ultimate outcome of an intervention and what we want to achieve. And this can be patient reach, but it doesn't need to be. It can be something else.
And I'm talking about what needs to be measured that needs tidying up. So I'm sure there are some things that are easier to harmonize that are not quite so, maybe not tension or with competitive sensitivities or transparency sensitivities. But okay, we talked about patient reach, tech transfer, and failures, measuring failures. But maybe it's not something to measure, but it's a contextual kind of acknowledgement. But what other things that need to be measured or that need to be debated about that might, need some attention to harmonize? So patient reach was one of them. What other bits of this could be the thing or a thing that is going to need a bit of attention and work? Is anyone? Hannah, looking.
I was just going to come back before you. I know you moved the conversation. I was just going to come back to the failures piece for a minute, and I was actually going to. The Access to Medicines Index was always designed to try to motivate by rewarding success and sort of measuring, and it's also a learning platform. It's very much trying to document over time. It's documented more and more about what's worked and what hasn't. It's never had, and I don't know how you do this, but like a category for who learned the most, or sort of who was there is a transparency metric as well, but it's often about sort of policies and principles as opposed to kind of sharing around access. But I'm kind of curious, how do you, maybe it's actually through the work that's proposed here in the kind of developing the science of access, is like, where is the forum to talk about failures and lessons? Because I do think, and it varies a lot by the issue at hand, but the quickness with which those to evaluate failure as, and then sort of cut grants or, switch partners, or just kind of assume that rather than it kind of reward, there's not a lot of reward, I would say, for people being very public right now around things not working. I think that was Michael's comment as well. And so I think one of the conversations here might be, what is the forum in which, because the aspiration of harmonization presupposes you actually know what works and can consistently, operate towards that. And another piece of these papers and things is all like, well, in fact, we haven't been investing enough in the innovation of access and so on, which to me suggests we actually don't know what to harmonize around yet. So I think creating that dynamic also around that learning agenda, which again, I want to appreciate, I haven't been in the details of this space for a number of years. So that piece of it could have advanced as well. But I do think that sort of to Michael's point and what Novartis was doing, how do you kind of replicate that and reward that as well without it seeming like it's, grade school and you're giving everyone a chance by congratulating everyone for trying. So I think there's an opportunity there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That's a great point on the harmonization, and we've discussed this in preparing the discussion today, that to move forward, how do we move forward with harmonization? Maybe what's needed is, before you decide what are you harmonizing, or what to harmonize around, as you say. So I guess it's thinking through what are the steps. Everyone agrees the end result, but I guess it has to be looked carefully as to what steps in what order to do that. But I'm going to open the conversation now up to the floor and online. But just so that I don't forget, lest they feel neglected, I'm going to go online first. And for the online questions, I'm going to read them out. And for the in-room questions, if you just put up your hand, someone will bring you a microphone. So get your questions ready. I'm going to pick this one here. Michael Strange. And I guess if any of you feel most moved to do it, because this doesn't seem to be targeted at any one of you specifically, how important is ownership, i.e. state, private sector, in determining levels of access? So I don't know if this kind of leads on to the industry-driven partnerships, public-driven led, who's leading the partnership. I don't know if that's what that's talking about, but ownership, i.e. state, private sector, in determining the levels of access. Who wants to go first? You don't volunteer, I'll pick you. Oh, good. I'll go.
This is an interesting question, and one that we've certainly been discussing quite extensively at the Access to Medicine Foundation for a variety of points. But to start, we obviously find that as a company, if you develop a very successful product, there is a responsibility to ensure that that product does reach those who need it the most. And there is that ownership that ultimately the company developing the product should also be responsible for ensuring access. But we do find that there's a very clear link as well in terms of governments or private foundations who are working in collaboration with pharmaceutical companies to also advance access. And to also be looking at what their role is. So that can manifest in different ways. It may be through a contractual agreement to have a clear, robust access plan in place, and to make sure that any new product that's being developed in partnership is made available and affordable in a timely manner to low and middle income countries, and is not only being developed sort of for high income markets. But there is a really interesting sort of level of collaboration that can really propel access much further and much faster when it's sort of really deeply embedded in the initial project stages, and in those initial sort of funding agreements and negotiations to say, listen, you need to prioritize access. If we're going to go in on this and we're going to partner, we really want to see that you have a strong access plan. We really want to see evidence that you're taking huge strides to make this product available and affordable. So I think there's ownership sort of from both sides, because you don't want to run into a problem where there is a great new product that's been developed in collaboration, but it's still not reaching those who need it the most. And that's obviously the worst case scenario, but it does happen from time to time for sure.
Thanks. Hannah, do you have thoughts on ownership and what matters in ownership?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. As I was thinking to the comment around, I guess it's, some of it is there may be handoffs in this exercise, right? So there'll probably be a transference of ownership across, again, depending on the product and the circumstance. I do think there needs to be someone ultimately kind of guiding and holding the value chain of activities accountable to an access end, as well as whatever other outcomes are intended. And I think that's part of what Margot was speaking to, which is there needs to be early consideration of, that this is an access-driven partnership, and that kind of you can come upon that later and do things. So it's not like if it didn't start early, it's inevitable. But I do think that is important. I was also thinking as far as government role, and then whose job is it to pull the people together? But a big hindrance to access could be regulatory, for example, in a country, and that's not something a manufacturer can prepare dossiers and apply, but if you don't have capacity in that country, so that's a great example to me of like sort of shared responsibility, I suppose, with regard to, getting those products out. And again, that's well known, but I think directionally, maybe if ownership sits with the manufacturer and they're committed, there's whoever needs to be engaging to make sure our destined countries are kind of prepared and ready to engage. And that seems like an odd construct, but anyway, I think there's also just some shared, who's the director, and then, what's the context in which the other partners are brought in. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael, if you've got burning need, otherwise I can move on, but jumping quickly if
Just
you want to.
a brief comment on a little nuance. I don't think that pharma companies have to ensure that everyone gets access to a product, because this is not considering the complexity in the healthcare system. Companies have to play a role, and they have an accountability in that regard. But if the system doesn't work, regulatory pathways as an example, if there is no diagnostic capability in a country, if there is no prescribing doctor, if there's no community health worker, good luck with your product. And I think we have to be clear about that. And I'm just saying this because when we speak about access, it's very much about different accountabilities related to different players within the healthcare sector. And here we have to talk about the accountabilities of the government, and they own the healthcare system, at least the public pieces. They have the regulatory authority in that country, and they have to do their thing, as the companies have to do their thing in order to make the product as widely available as possible. But it's too easy to say companies have to ensure access, because I believe it's not considering the different accountabilities in the system. And that's good that there are different accountabilities. It would be wrong if there would be a monopoly on accountability in that healthcare system.
I guess that speaks to, if you're trying to measure the effectiveness of a partnership versus measuring the effectiveness of it, industry participation in a partnership. If you're measuring the effectiveness of the partnership, the score on that may not be wholly to do, it probably is not going to be wholly to do with the industry's participation in that partnership. So maybe it's important, if you're looking at what makes partnerships work, to look at the big picture as well without, overcomplicating it.
I believe both is needed, but they are, of course, also correlated.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at the overall effectiveness of partnership, and one of the stakeholders being involved is the private sector, and the effectiveness of that private sector intervention is not going well,
sure,
then most likely the effectiveness of the overall partnership is not where it should be.
But even if they're doing their role to a fairly good degree, they should not be judged on the effectiveness of the whole partnership for the bits that aren't theirs, I guess. Right, I'm going to go to the floor. We had the first person I saw was actually next to you, this gentleman here in the blue suit. Then we'll go to you next. And please state who you are and your question, and whether it's directed at anyone in particular. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Jürgen Kretz from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I have a comment and a question. In the very beginning of the discussion, one of you mentioned the reporting requirements to public donors. And I would admit we are actually part of the problem, because every country has different standards at the National Office of Auditing, or we have to report to national parliaments. And of course, what is needed as information to a public political debate is different than in an expert debate. So I would say we're part of the problem, but I still think we do need to harmonize the way we measure impact and report. And I think national governments on the donor side have to contribute to that. And I also have a question. Michael mentioned the ESG reporting requirements. And in a previous position, I worked on working conditions in global supply chains. And I think there we usually focus on minimizing negative impacts. And here, when we look at access, we look at maximizing positive impacts. And my question would be, is there a difference in your point of view how you can measure that or how you work with this type of data.
Thank you, Michael.
My first reaction would be, I believe it's both. When you think about access, there is a risk consideration that you need to explore in regard to lack of access, and you need to understand that in the ESG world, because you need to communicate to investors about that risk and how you mitigate it in most tangible terms. But there is also a value side of that discussion. Access can lead to maybe better market opportunities in the future. And that's also something you should consider as a company and respectively report about it. So I believe both is needed. It's not just risk. And by the way, even in supply chain, I believe it's both. Because by improving supply chain conditions, you might also increase productivity in your supply chain. It's not just protecting the worker from harm. It's maybe also driving upsides by making these kind of investments. And therefore, I believe it's both. And there are differences. There are differences most likely in terms of indicators that you need to look into. And there are differences in terms of your theory of change that you would apply with regards to risk and opportunities in order to really understand what you need to know from an indicator perspective.
Thank you. Please ask your next question.
Yeah.
Then
So I'm
from-
Saba Hussein from Eli Lilly, based in Indianapolis. So the question I have is, we talk about the role of industry in access strategies and in patient reach, but what about the role of governments and ministries of health really creating that infrastructure or the commitment, even if they don't have the dollars, to provide that last mile to the patient, or even not the last mile, it probably starts at the moment the product probably is available in that country. And I'll even take the example, because we talk about LMICs when we get into this conversation, but what about high income countries like the United States, for example, where access in certain states due to Medicaid expansion or whatever, you have 50% populations, say example in South Dakota, uninsured. You rely on product donations, and what is the role of government there in enabling access and providing access to patients? And you talk about these are high income countries where you can provide the most innovative products, but what's the role of government here? You can provide the product, manage costs or payer reimbursement strategies, but what about the role of government? So I really want to tie that into sort of the reach to the patient.
Sure. And I guess, unless the government is part of the partnership, that's not really about measuring the effectiveness of the partnership. There may be other forces outside of the partnership that are influencing access. It's not to say that partnership's the only influencing factor of access. And of course, when you're talking about the role of government in access, this brings us, circular back to the discussion of UHC, universal health coverage. If there is not, coverage and financial protection and government investment to create the enabling environment, then you're going to have trouble. But my colleague, my boss, Rob Yates, is our super expert on this. But Rob, do you have something to say that will address that government thing other than taxpayer-funded healthcare?
Well, very much so. And I think this is an excellent point. And it was the point that Michael was making about the shared responsibilities in ensuring access, and that there's just so much that companies can do. And one of the most fundamental and obvious ways to increase access, certainly in terms of poor and vulnerable people accessing these very important medicines, is that they're provided totally free of charge. And that we've seen some spectacular studies sort of showing that just even the tiniest co-payment can basically see demand for a number of products just go off a cliff. There's a very famous paper by Michael Kramer, the Nobel laureate, showing that when just a 10-cent charge was put in place for deworming medicines in Kenya, utilization went down 76%. We see it all over the world, that just very low co-payments can absolutely kill access for some extremely important medicines. And I think, the shared responsibilities for that being some of the development policies imposed on countries, across the years. And that goes for the likes of the UK government and the US government and the World Bank, back in the day, enforcing healthcare user fees on poor countries. So I think we realise now just how important, perhaps one of the most obvious things to improve access is that sort of poor people who haven't got any money can't afford them.
Okay, thank you, Rob. I'm going to go back online and then I'll come over to this side of the room. This is a question from Maureen McIntosh, who says the recent Access to Medicine Index report notes that during the pandemic, key access partners with innovative companies were Serum Institute of India and Biomanagico's Fiocruz Brazil. Both have had considerable support from large middle-income country governments. What support can be offered to support the emergence of more effective partners of this type, e.g. in African context? I don't know if Hannah, is this something you wanted to take on first? It seems most suitable for you.
I can actually, because I was in the middle of writing a response. I mean, obviously it's a very complex and important question and very timely, again, with a lot of conversation right now about how to build sustainable industry, but as well as sort of viable responses in the context of a pandemic. So it's a really important question. I mean, if you take serums very specifically, as Maureen, you mentioned, it was a combination of industrial policy over many years and, well known. So that's trade, IP policy, demand, huge demand in country, various things that help support a manufacturer, but at the same time, a lot of global partnering support, whether that was with PATH, Gates Foundation, quite a lot of financing, where there's a lot of emphasis on specific antigens where there was a clear global need. And so, as well as technical assistance through those partnerships to help the manufacturer kind of evolve along its pathway towards being both competitive and innovative. So it's been over a long period of time that those manufacturers have been built up into the global arena. And so what's the complement in terms of a mix of activities to help support enabling industry? And again, it's a huge topic that a big question is like, what is the comparable to India for Africa, where there might be size of the volumes of demand may be comparable, but the ability to instrumentalize industrial policy at a continent level, is not the same. So I would also say the role of partnerships between manufacturers, and this comes back to the tech transfer point and sort of what is the aspiration as far as building industry and how is that shared as an objective across sort of global and local manufacturers, because a key piece of that will also be not just literally the tech transfer, but the partnership and the learning and the building that needs to happen. So I'm not sure what the government policy intervention will be within any one African country, but I do think there's quite a lot of attention right now to what is that package of activities that will help sponsor and advance, while at the same time recognizing access in the long term may be, there's a risk that as you build industry and kind of adjust and alter the composition of global competitors, you could have short-term or medium-term limiting effects on access with the long-term goal of creating sort of new partners in that space. So it's a very interesting and complicated topic, but thanks for the question. I think it's a good one.
Thanks. Over here, there was a hand. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Herbert Band. I'm an independent global health advisor in Switzerland. I've been doing some work with IFPMA on access metrics. We've talked about important goals here like harmonization, simplification, incentivizing value-adding activities like strong, effective partnerships. I'd like to introduce an additional criterion, which may be a bit challenging, and that's flexibility. So how to make access reporting, access measurement fit for purpose for companies. And I say that because even looking at the biggest biopharma companies in the world, there's a wide range of different strategies, structures, portfolios, geographic footprints, even within the biggest companies. And when you go to medium-sized companies, you see that. If you look at med tech and diagnostics companies, it's totally different. So the question is there a way to allow enough flexibility so companies can really report on where they're focusing and prioritizing their efforts? Because I used to work for a company that decided it could have a better impact if we doubled down on NCDs and making biologic medicines more widely available, rather than trying to solve problems of infectious disease or neglected tropical diseases where, frankly, the company had no expertise. So is there a way to enable this flexibility and enable companies to focus and prioritize where they can add the most value? I would note that the Gates Foundation and the Global Fund also focus and prioritize on certain global health challenges and not others. Thank you.
Sure, maybe part of that is the name of the Global Fund, of course, but are you suggesting that flexibility is a trade-off to harmonization, or are you saying that the two can coexist? It seems to me like a trade-off.
I
And
think we
where
need
is
to,
the line of the trade-off? Is that what you're asking?
I think the trade-off is between flexibility and comparability as well as
Exactly.
harmonization. So
Yeah.
I'm just throwing that into the mix of something that I think needs to be debated. I don't believe there's an easy answer to it, but I think if we have a very rigid framework that expects that all companies should be engaged in the same types of activities across the board, I don't think that's the most effective way to go about it. I think we
No,
lose
totally
something.
good. And that's a great point that will be brought into the discussion this afternoon. So I think I'm going to leave that for now because I've stolen 5 minutes extra than I was allowed, but I'm going to go to one more question here and I think we'll wrap it up. And if anyone has, okay, we'll see how it goes as far as speed. Otherwise, we'll do after we go offline. Go ahead.
I'll be quick. It's Brendan Shaw from Shoreview Consulting. Thanks to the panel. The phrase I've written down is measuring failure, which has negative connotations in it, but actually in the experience is actually you learn a lot from analysing failures. My question is how do we get a safe space where we can do some of this? Because my sense is that companies, international organisations, certainly governments don't often like measuring failure and looking and unpeeling it and what didn't work. I'm just wondering whether there's ways we can make it easier for some of these organisations to do that.
Okay, thanks. We'll take the next question and then we'll answer and that'll be it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nina Steensma with the Clinton Health Access Initiative. The question I have is perhaps to Michael or to Hannah, well, all of you. Can you speak a little bit more about the challenges related to measuring patient reach? And maybe this ties a little bit to what you're saying, because I'm surprised by that. I mean, I work in the space and I know how hard it can be, but it's just absolutely indispensable to measure that. First and foremost, mostly to learn like, hey, what works, what doesn't. Is the effort that the investment that we're making eventually reaching its purpose? Like, hey, it's central to the term of access. So I would love to better understand, like, hey, what are those particular challenges to measure that? I think indeed, like, hey, to help inform like what works, what doesn't, but also to hold different actors accountable. I appreciate that, like, hey, private sector can. It has one role to play in this discussion, and that there are other actors that need to be held accountable. But if we're not measuring the end outcome, how can you make that point effectively without doing so? So understanding like what are the challenges in measuring the eventual impact on patients and
okay, thanks. That last question is a whole nother discussion, a whole nother panel, but I'm gonna put it to it. And okay, I'll do one more and then we will choose. We're not going to answer, everyone's not going to answer every question, but very last question to throw into the mix. We've got safe space for failure and we've got challenges of measuring patient reach. And one last throw in.
Thank you. I know we're short on time and I'll try to be quick, but I heard Michael say
Please say who you are first.
Sorry, yes. I'm Sumi Krishnamurthy with RTI International. I'm an independent consultant. And I heard Michael say a lot about the value of understanding context, right? Like this is why some interventions fail and some interventions work. And so if we think a little bit about context, there's also a point there about patients being different in each context. And so my question is about how far can we push our understanding of access to really think about our accountabilities to the patient, right? Like that's surely what matters most. And in terms of measurement, is there any way that we can really reconsider our accountabilities with patients and involve them and become part of the process and make sure that there's a true access there? Thank you.
Thanks. I think we're going to put the patient reach challenges and accountability to patient together and then safe space for failure. Who wants to come in on what? This is our last. Margot, go ahead. Yep.
I think it's a hugely important component of learning to have those conversations. The Access to Medicine Foundation has Amsterdam sessions where we bring together a variety of different players, from large R&D based pharmaceutical companies to generic medicine manufacturers and government representatives and community representatives, to have those conversations and to be able to say, sort of behind closed doors, Chatham House rule, what has worked well and what hasn't. And we've seen tremendous progress as a result, to be able to say, in this sort of closed space, this is what we learned as a company. This is the benefit of the partnership. This is who we relied on and why, but also, this is what we could be doing more of. And I think for companies to hear that from their peers is hugely valuable. So there certainly are those forums. I totally agree with you. I think there could be many more, and there could be many more opportunities to unpack some of these issues. But we have found that at the foundation, it's a hugely beneficial component. And we see the results in the next index. For example, in 2019, we had a session on access planning. What are the challenges with access planning? What's in the realm of possibility? Can a company realistically plan for access across their entire portfolio, or is that too big of an ask? And at the time, we heard a lot of companies say, that's impossible. It's too much of a burden. We will prioritize sort of a subset of diseases, but we can't do it for everything. And then we had one company, Novartis, sort of say, we're going to do this, we're going to commit to this, we're going to try. And then in the most recent Access to Medicine Index in 2022, we actually saw 6 companies planning strategically for access across their entire portfolio. So you can also kind of have these conversations and say, I thought that this was entirely impossible, and it's not 3 or 4 years later. So you can see that progress, and you can unpack some of those challenges and those myths. And really sort of collectively say, let's try something different. If my peer is doing it, so can I. And those sort of behind closed doors conversations that are really honest and open can lead to really substantial results in the future.
Okay, thank you on that. Who wants to take on challenges of measuring patient reach, but a quick one-liner, or accountability to patient? How do we build that in as our final goodbye? Michael.
I don't think that it's so difficult, but we have to be clear about who's providing access to medicines. So a pharma company can't measure patient reach by tracing the product until the patient level, because that's not what we do. That's what the government does. So when we calculate patient reach, it's based on the volume of medicine that we provide to the system. The key problem here is there is a lack of alignment in the methodology within the sector, how you do that. And that's creating not coherent information for the recipients of that data point, and therefore they can't compare. The government, if you look into the vaccination world, in a public healthcare system, they give the vaccine to the patient, so they can calculate patient reach in completely different ways than we do. We are not administering the vaccine as an example, and therefore we need different calculation methods. And I think we have to be clear about that first and foremost, and then we need to define methodologies to calculate it in a robust and comparable way. If you allow me to say something about the failure as well, because I brought that topic up, I would really turn it around. This is not just about having a confidential conversation on failures. Come on. If companies start to talk about access programs and they do this in this, well, we achieved and success and great what we have done, everyone says, well, really true? There's a lot of scrutiny towards private sector. So let's put things on the table. Let's be honest. I believe, and that's my experience as well, this gives us much more credibility because everyone knows how complex the system is. So don't tell vanilla sky stories about that. Be clear about the challenges we are confronted with as a private sector player in the healthcare system. And this leads to an honest and credible discussion.
Thank you. That's a great way to end. And you know, spoken as a former journalist, I would totally concur with the need to warts and all for credibility. So I'm sorry, and thank you for bearing with us online. We went over, and apologies groveling to Veronica, whose time I've stolen, but we will steal it from lunch. So we're going to get back on track. I'm going to close. We are now closing the online portion of the day's event. So thank you all online for bearing with us for this long morning. But hopefully it's been fruitful, and there were more questions we couldn't get to. So, so much more to talk about and to feed into this afternoon's discussion. So I'm going to give over the floor to Veronica now. Thank you.